Dave Snowden is an extremely influential thinker and innovator who's operated both in the civil society and the corporate world with some of the best and brightest leaders and governments from across the world. His frameworks and tools are used in many different fields and facets of both civil and corporate life, from his decision making framework called the Kinevin framework to his mass ethnography tool and approach called SenseMaker to his latest endeavors in complexity frameworks, estuarine mapping, and now he talks to me about risk management as well. Dave has been one of my mentors over the past 2 to 3 years. And a conversation with Dave would not be a conversation with Dave if he had not challenged me on some of my thinking, corrected some of the things that I said, and invited me to consider much more nuanced and context applicable variables and constraints in our exchanges. That is just how Dave is, and that is one of the reasons that I'm so grateful that he has been so generous with his time and his ideas with me over the past years. I'm so happy that Dave said yes to have this conversation where we talked about things going on in society at the grand scale and at the local scale, and also some of the corporate landscape that we both face on a regular basis, and how his way of seeing organizations and systems and the tools that he offers are probably the best or some of the best available to us to make sense of where it is that we want to go and how it is that we want to get there. So, this is a personal favorite of mine. And definitely, I hope that everyone is going to enjoy this episode of Think with my guest, Dave Snowden. Dave Snowden, welcome to Think.
Always a pleasure.
Dave, so nice to have you here. Um, Everything you've done, I think, over the last 50, 60 years, you're one of the forefathers of complexity thinking. Your decision making framework, Kinevin, has stood the test of time. It's probably the most used framework that we still have today when it comes to decision making. Your sense maker tool and mass ethnography way of thinking, and bringing that both to the corporate and to the let's say political and social sphere now, along with estuarine mapping, which is your current I think one of your current endeavors around a true complexity framework, and besides that, the blog, which you write a lot on. As we start our conversation today, and that's obviously just a little, just a little of everything that you've done and everything that you've contributed. What would you like my listeners and viewers to know about you as we start our conversation?
Um, Not sure really. I mean, I think a lot of that I just happened to be the first to do something, and it therefore took off. So if you look at Kinevin, it was one of the first models that used complexity theory, but said human beings can create order. Whereas the Stacey framework, which came out at about the same time, said everything is complex, and that I don't think is that practical. So I think that was it. I think also I was really lucky in that when I was in IBM, we got this major DARPA contract, which I co-led with Menlo Park, and that was looking at conflict in policy formation with some, very senior players in, the Pentagon, the state, and the CIA. And that drove then with 9/11, which hit in the middle of that project, into weak signal detection, in how do you understand when civilians are going from tacit to explicit support of terrorism.
Hmm.
And that got to the attention of the Singapore government. So I was able to leave IBM and set up the company on the first big contract. So a lot of this, I think, is, and I'd make this as a general point, is be in the right place at the right time, but just be open to things which aren't conventional and which, look interesting, is my general view on this.
Can you, I mean, it's obviously there's no red thread, as we know, like a perfect line between things, but can you trace back some of the elements in your life which led you to want to question things and examine things the way that you have? Because there are other paths, of course, that you could have gone, but you went this path in my view of, well, hold on a second. Some things may have direct cause and effect, but we can't split up the whole world in every, let's say, system like that. Can you trace some of the elements which contributed to you actually going down that path of
Yeah, I mean,
investigation?
I originally went up to university to read physics and philosophy.
Hmm.
which, to be honest, is designed for lazy undergraduates because you can either do it or you can't. I mean, engineers have to work. We didn't. But I think one of the key things which came out of that early interest in physics is, I mean, we used to say, for example, social scientists suffer from physics envy, which was a deliberate play on words. I.e., they never have enough data to form any predictive conclusion. Doesn't mean they can't do explanatory work. And then gradually, I mean, I had a family where if we liked you, we argued with you over the dinner table, and we were only polite if we weren't sure about you yet. All right. So that and that carries over, and I effectively debated every week from the age of 11 through until my mid-20s.
Mm.
Yeah, both at school and university. So that makes you critical. It makes you questioning. Particularly interestingly, when you have to argue for things that you don't believe in with no notice about what you've got to do, that is a really good training. Yeah, so I went through that. I think what then happened is when I was in general management and then strategy management before we were bought by IBM, I got really fed up with management fads. It was like, it was like every year or 2 years, all of a sudden we'd have a whole new thing. All of us who were actually bringing in the money for the company had to suddenly rename everything we were doing in new language just to keep people happy, right? And that was part of the push on Cynefin is, but there's nothing wrong with business process reengineering when it came out. I mean, it'd been better if it had been based on Tom Davenport's work, but, the popular guys did it. But then people took it too far. And then, of course, we have to abandon that. Then it's learning organization, blue ocean strategy. Now it's agile. And it was basically kind of like, guys, all this stuff works, but it works within some context, and you're
Hmm.
trying to make it universal. So that was a real big push on Cynefin.
Yeah, I look forward to asking you so many questions today and exploring different tangents. Um, I think one of them is exactly around. I mean, the fads and the application of one framework, or the let's say attempt to apply one framework everywhere, independent of context, is still something that is rife, obviously, in the business world today. Um, do you think, like, we still see the desire to gain efficiencies through centralizations of large systems, ERPs, or other types of systems, whereby it's done across 15, 25 countries within an organization? And then everyone has to pool, their the requests that they have for new features into one mega list, and there's only so much capacity that you can roll out in a year, so you do remove some innovation and flexibility in many areas. um, do you think there's that still makes sense from a cost efficiency perspective? I'm sure. I mean, it's very contextual. Again, you can't apply an answer to every single organization, but we see a lot of that fads still there today. And then in 2 years, they're decided by, or another one comes saying, "Oh, the last one was good, but it wasn't perfect. Let's do this one. This one's going to be perfect." And then, yeah, we just repeat that cycle. What's your view on where we are today with regards
And
to
I
that?
think it depends a lot on context. I mean, back in the 80s, I set up one of the first SAP businesses in the UK.
Hmm.
Yeah. That was sort of Aris toolset consultancy, and then build into SAP, which was an ex IBM group. Yeah. Um, and that was at the start of ERP. Now, if you start to look at that, there was huge value in that. In fact, it probably saved a whole bunch of companies from bankruptcy and actually stopped the world going into recession at one point.
Oh, well.
Um, and in a commodified worldwide marketplace, you need to get into standards.
Hmm.
But it is quite interesting that retailers, and I was doing a lot of work with retail at that time, they didn't go down the ERP route. They actually kept multiple systems and took on the cost of interfacing.
Mm.
And if you then looked at some SAP implementations, the cycle time to upgrade them was actually longer than the changed context of the market.
Oh, yeah.
So the FMCG people knew that instinctively, so they didn't go down that route. But then, I was working on stock management with British Aerospace, sorry, and also with the supply agency of NATO. Lead times there are 20, 30 years. So there you need that. Um, so I think it's this key question about context is understanding context, understanding what's sensible. And the big thing SRI mapping does is it looks at energy cost over time.
Hmm.
And that's a key principle on this is, how much energy is this going to take? How much time has it got? Is it resilient? Is it non-resilient? The questions we're now asking are about what is realistic for people to do given the current context of uncertainty, rather than assuming, and it always amused me, this American companies adopting the planning cycle of Soviet Russia, that you can actually plan things over a 3 or 5 year cycle. And I think even although the big manufacturing companies have still got to do that, anybody who's involved in the service industry knows that's no longer viable.
Hmm. So I tend to explain it this way when I try my best to, I don't want to say convince, but to extol the values of having a direction without a fixed predetermined arrival point in 5 years. I say, well, let's say you want to cross, and it's probably an example that you've given, but let's say you want to cross a river. Okay, you know you want to get to the other side, but the point of saying I want to land exactly at that tree in 2 years, where actually that part of the forest may be burning in 2 years, and you're going to try to force the entire universe to get you to that one place, as opposed to saying, well, I want to get to the other side of that river. I know generally where I think I'm going to land, but based on the conditions and what happens, I may land somewhere else, another tree, which actually will be more beneficial than if I had landed at the one that I had planned to land on 2 years ago. Eh,
Yeah, and I think landscape metaphors work quite well. I'm not sure I'd use the stream because if you've got to cross the stream, you've got to get it over with, right?
okay,
And,
two
and,
years
and
is maybe
sorry,
a bit long.
I do a lot of mountain walking, all right? If you've got a fast flowing stream, you get 5 or 6 people, you bundle together in a crocodile and you go very, very slowly and you have a destination, right?
yeah.
But I think the general principle is you can't understand on a complex changing landscape. You can identify where you should go next. This is called the adjacent possible in complexity.
Yep.
So it's go there and look again. I think the other thing I'm increasingly talking about is alignment rather than purpose.
Okay.
So if you look at antelope behavior, what they do when they meet a predator, and there's a good exercise you can do with a team on this, which is to get everybody in the team to identify their best friend and their worst enemy. Before you tell them to do that, you tell them not to look at anybody or say anything, and you say they can choose at random. They never do, so it's quite interesting if you're the manager to observe what happens. You need about 20 people plus for this.
Okay.
And ask them to organize themselves so their best friend is between them and their worst enemy, i.e., behave selfishly in accordance with the principles of neoliberal economics.
Mm-hmm.
At that point, the group dissipates all over the room. Yeah. If you change the rule to say position yourself between your best friend and your enemy, the group clumps together immediately.
Hmm.
Now, that comes from antelope behavior. So, if a predator arrives, every antelope generally looks at the pattern of markings on the bum of the next one
Yep.
and then basically positions themselves between the predator and one other antelope, and they just keep on that.
Mm-hmm.
And that way, the whole herd stays together, and you can't pick off individuals, which is a danger with a selfish one.
Yep.
But the antelope herd then stays together, even though it goes to destinations. It's not being driven by purpose. That was the classic Peter Senge systems dynamics. We handle uncertainty by saying where we want to be.
Mm-hmm.
What complexity science says is actually you just need to keep things together and have much more flexibility on where you're going.
Hmm.
And we're now starting to look at alignment principles and distributed decision making, and that's the whole body of new work coming out at the moment
Hmm.
as an alternative to purpose statements, mission statements, value statements, deep purpose statements, North Stars, and all that nonsense.
Yeah, I feel like, I mean, starting with the why has been like over abused. I mean, of course, there's no problem. It makes sense to have a why, but when all other conditions within, let's say, an organization are people, let's say, are not well paid, they're not involved in any sort of fair process in terms of, like establishing new processes or changing the organization, but there's a why statement everywhere, and to believe that just having a strong why is going to make everyone suddenly feel engaged doesn't seem to reflect reality in my view. Would you
And
agree?
it can get quite manipulative. So I remember one UK company that got caught up in one of these sort of consultancy enterprises, which was more reminiscent of a Billy Graham evangelical crusade than of genuine social science. And they ended up actually building a massive tent in Birmingham, and all staff were required to volunteer to go and spend a whole day in these indoctrination sessions
Hmm.
so that they actually were conformant. And that was literally a sort of, destroy variety in the system type
Hmm.
approach.
Yeah.
And if people didn't do it, they were subject to massive social pressure. Now, what was interesting when the whole thing fell apart, it was bound to all of a sudden people who'd been doing the social pressure tried to pretend they'd been against it from the first. And I knew the mavericks involved in that. They were punished by both sides regardless, right? So I think this desire for conformity, we talk a lot in Anthro Complexity about requisite variety.
Mm-hmm.
You need enough variety in the system that the system can adapt under conditions of uncertainty. And this works in English. It doesn't work in Swedish because they have the same word. But you want a system which is effective. And the more uncertain the world is, the more inefficiency you need in order to be effective, because you need redundancy in the system.
Yeah, because I would imagine if you're standardized, sort of conform, then you won't have the adaptive capability to deal with the uncertainty
Yeah,
because
but
you have one
a bit
model.
of that is granularity. So, I mean, I
Mm.
got heavily involved in object orientation in the 1980s.
Okay.
And I was arguing then that people are objects too.
Okay.
If you put a combination of roles together, it can have inheritance, it can be polymorphic, you can
Mm-hmm.
define input output. And we're now actually bringing some of this back in software architecture and saying what you need to do, and it's called the lowest level of coherent granularity, is the technical phrase for this,
Okay.
is you really want to develop software and people objects at the right level of granularity and then allow them to interact
Mm-hmm.
and actually then amplify the patterns of interaction which are useful and dampen the ones which aren't.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in software development, that can actually radically reduce the cost of software delivery
Okay.
because you can use people objects for the 10% of the project, which we'll call 90% of the grief, and then wait to see what patterns of response come before you further automate. So
Mm-hmm.
that's something we're looking at. So I think the key thing is to standardize at a low level of granularity. I mean, we're doing this with the Hexi project on software development methods.
Yeah.
Is we've broken all the frameworks, or rather, the framework owners are breaking them down into their lowest coherent component, and then people can recombine those components from different vendors.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, that's a much more resilient principle, and it follows the basic complexity principle that you never scale a system by imitating the output of a process.
Okay.
You scale by decomposition and recombination and replicating journey starts. So illustrate that a bit.
Okay.
If you look at the Grameen Bank in social welfare, that was a huge initiative in Bangladesh. It was absolutely brilliant. It transformed the economy. Mohammed Yunus, who initiated it, was never given the Nobel Prize for economics because neoclassical economics would never reward anything as useful as that. But he got the Peace Prize, right? But then people tried to replicate the outcome of a social process which had developed over several decades
Mm-hmm.
as the output into Africa. So it moved from a matriarchal to a patriarchal culture. It failed completely.
Okay.
And everything was made explicit, and the loan sharks learned how to exploit it. So it went wrong in Bangladesh as well. And I think that's where complexity gives us a whole new way of scaling, is we say we break things down, we allow them to recombine, and we allow people to start journeys with similar input because then they will involve contextual appropriate solutions. You don't assume that somebody else's context is going to be yours. And the key metaphor in that is the difference between a recipe book user and a chef.
Mm-hmm.
So a chef can combine different ingredients in context and improvise, whereas a recipe user always has to follow a process.
Yeah.
And part of the big problem, and this started in the 80s, to be honest, everybody criticizes scientific management. They're not criticizing scientific management, they're criticizing systems dynamics, for God's sake. Scientific management is actually more humane than systems dynamics. But the idea was you would have these absolute standard recipes. And the big consultancies grew on that. So consultancies, good question to ask a consultant is what's the ratio between your principals and your ordinary workers? And if it's more than about 1 to 7, 1 to 10, you've got a
Yeah.
manufacturing model, not an apprentice model.
Mm.
And of course, manufacturing models are driven by recipes and high utilization. And again, that was a really significant problem, and that's continued to this day. Nobody in a big consultancy wants to work on a short program because the utilization goes wrong.
Yeah.
So I think we got these perverse structures we built into the system now.
And is that why? And so most people won't know that you and I have known each other for a couple of years, and I consider you one of my mentors. So this question may be a little bit rhetorical, but is that why it's so? I find so difficult to sell to or for senior executives to actually move away from those prescribed? Yeah.
I think people need to get realistic about this, all right?
Okay.
In that things go in cycles. There's a framework we got, which used to be called Apex Predator Theory, is now called Fletcher's Curves.
Yep.
And it points out when a new idea comes in, the idea with its dominance, you can't disrupt it until it starts to fail.
Okay.
So, and your strategy is very different dependent on where you are in the life cycle.
Mm-hmm.
So, one of the things we've noticed, and COVID triggered it. After COVID, nobody could believe they could plan for all contingencies, not realistically. And that makes people aware of other stuff. So these days, whereas before COVID, we were selling the theory to get contracts from early adopters.
Yeah.
We're now really not talking about the theory much. We're talking about the output, what sort of things we can give you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's the sort of you can see therefore that switch from systems thinking to complexity science. The other sign, by the way, is everybody in systems thinking is now saying they manage complexity. They didn't used to use the word, but now they're using it extensively, right? So things go in cycles, and there's nothing really wrong with that because we tend to exploit an idea, then we need to move on to something new.
Right.
But you need to be where you are. I think the other big thing, and Agile makes this mistake massively, all right, partly because none of them have ever worked at sea level, is at sea level, you might get 4 or 5 minutes to make a decision between five well researched projects.
Yep.
Yeah, you've got stakeholder pressures that you can't tell the people involved in.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want a C-level executive to do something, you've got to address risk, and risk is personal to their careers more than to their company, and that's
Mm.
just being realistic.
Yep.
You've got to address in a recession cost reduction, and you've got to address a low energy solution to problems which are keeping them awake at night.
Mm.
And if you do that, you can get entry.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And that's the key strategy, I think, for most of us at the moment, because we're in that sort of turnover between cycles,
Yep.
and then new patterns will emerge. And I still remember in the 80s, I was working then on soft systems methodology, on some early aspects of cybernetics, which at the time were really progressive. We just got better science now, right?
Mm-hmm.
And everybody's saying this is far too academic. Why are you bothering with it? And then 2 years later, everybody's talking about it and it totally dominates. And that's what happens.
So conditions are or have changed. They were already changing, but COVID made clear the level of uncertainty in which we currently live, and that has helped to trigger, let's say, and that maybe with the previous frameworks, not to single out any one, but it can be agile or Scrum or safe, or in certain contexts, actually not bringing the results which they believed or had been promised, allows them to consider something else now.
I'd
And
qualify that a bit, all right?
yep.
So I said there was nothing wrong with BPR provided you kept it within a closed system
Hmm.
like manufacturing. There was everything wrong when you went to an open system, right?
Right.
Um, Scrum.org, I mean, Scrum is a brilliant collection of methods, all right?
Hmm.
It's highly progressive. Um, but there are times when you should do waterfall.
Yes.
And what happened with the Agile movement, and I still remember working on this with Telstra in Brisbane, and nobody got promoted unless they were Agile. So people doing waterfall projects created 1 year sprints so they could say they were Agile. And that inauthentic behavior is a real problem.
Hmm.
But then, interestingly, when SAFe came along, that's when a whole group of us said, right, Agile's over.
Hmm. Okay.
Because one of the early signs of the end of a movement is extreme commodification. And that's what SAFe did.
Hmm.
All right. So when that happens, you know the market's going to be ready for something new fairly soon because it destroyed variety in the Agile workplace.
Could, in theory, a complexity framework eventually become highly commodified, and then there's a need for?
Um, I think so. I think that there is a big difference between what we're doing at the moment, along with others,
Yeah.
is that this is the first time people have used natural science as an enabling constraint rather than using cases and social constructions.
Hmm.
Right? And that's a big difference.
Yeah.
Now, if you go back into scientific management and you actually bother to read the books at the time, and I got beaten up by Peter Drucker on this, so I learnt my lesson. If you look at the nature of the workplace before Taylor came along, it was pretty bloody barbaric.
Hmm.
So Taylor is actually introducing something which actually increases safety in the workplace and increases worker engagement. Now, in the modern context, we see it as highly routine, but you need to read it in context.
Mm.
Interestingly, Taylor insists on apprentice schemes for managers.
Mm.
So the idea of somebody doing a business studies degree, doing an MBA in an elite American university, becoming a consultant, and 10 years later becoming CEO of a company without any experience, that would be anathema to scientific management. Yeah. But then say what happens in the 80s is that's when the popular forms of systems thinking, and that was typified by Senge, by BPR come in,
Mm-hmm.
and now the metaphor is engineering. Yeah. So I think what we're now doing is basically saying, look, stop thinking about cases and repeating it.
Yeah.
Stop creating effectively your own perceptual judgment of a model which would fit the cases. And that goes from sort of fairly authentic work to the extremes of things like reinventing the organization by the Crocs,
Yeah.
which actually only selects data which supports the thesis and ignores data which contradicts it.
Mm.
But instead, start with there's lots of things we know about how human beings make decisions, which have come from cognitive neuroscience, which have been subject to repeatable experiments by more than one person, which are subject to peer review. There's things we know about systems, there's things we know about sensory data, there's things we know about epigenetics and such like.
Mm-hmm.
So, what we started to do is say, let's build methods and tools coherent to the science. So, we can't use scientific method on a human system overall. There's just too many factors.
Yeah.
And that's created the current crisis in psychology, in that nobody can repeat the traditional experiments.
Yeah.
But you can say, okay, we know, for example, human beings will scan maybe 3 or 4% of available data, and they'll do partial memories and hallucinations and entanglement with sensory data, which we don't understand.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, they'll do a first fit pattern match. So as long as the pattern fits, they'll work with it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the famous case about the radiologists where they, 83% do not see a gorilla in X-rays because they're not expecting to see it. So once you get that, then you can say, right, so we need to build tools which assume people will not see things regardless of their training, their competence, their information flow.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, for example, where some of our work is to allow you to put a problem to the whole workforce and get the data back within 5 minutes without anybody having a chance to talk about it. And that way we find the people who are seeing gorillas and we find the belief patterns.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's why this is going to sustain longer. And remember, scientific management held together for about 80, 90 years. And systems thinking has held together for maybe 2, 3 decades.
Yeah.
And I think those are the sort of patterns you see. If you really want to get into philosophy on it, it's quite Hegelian. Yeah, you get an antithesis which claims it's different but isn't really different, but it creates a space for something completely new.
Does that require, um, let's say, uh, I mean, to take a complexity approach, in my view, is compared to being sold, let's say, a path or framework by a consulting company, doesn't matter the size, let's say. Um, does it require that senior executives are a little bit more open to failure and learning and adaptation?
No, that's a mistake. No senior executive is open to failure.
Period.
Yeah, full stop. Right. So
But then doesn't it make it more difficult to come in with complexity?
no, because you need to look at the granularity of failure.
Okay.
So in fact, some of the stuff you're doing at the moment is to create role-based combinations. So human beings didn't evolve to make decisions as
Yeah.
individuals. They evolved to make decisions in sexual pairs, extended families, or
Mm-hmm.
clans. And those decisions are always heavily role based, not
Mm-hmm.
individual based. And I would say one of the big problems you've got in North Atlantic thinking, and I'll blame the Reformation for this, is the over focus on the individual as against the interactions in
Yeah.
the community. So the assumption is all change is about changing this nonsense like mindset or
Mm-hmm.
mental models. Yeah, now the reality is those are emergent properties. Yeah, if you change people's interactions, they'll change over time. So coming back to the case, we can, and we also know, by the way, that stress chemicals are not released in the brain if you're in a group, in a role-based group, but they are if you're in a team based on
Yeah.
individuals,
Okay.
which is why in medical and military, everything is
Mm-hmm.
role-based. And we also know that if you know you're being observed, but you don't know who the observer is, you're more likely to be honest, called the
Mm-hmm.
panopticon effect, right? So what we do is basically say, well, if you can self-form a team of, 4 people or 6 people, and you accept a completely anonymous team member, so you don't know who it is. It might be a committee, it might be a person, it might be AI. You can spend this amount of money without further reference, provided you record what you're doing, what you did, and what happened. Now, from an executive point of view, I can set that running and have 100 experiments at $1,000.
It's fine. Yeah.
And then the ones which work, I can then put the real money
Mm-hmm.
into those. Now, what I've just done is solve a massive problem for
Yeah.
C-level. So instead of them having to decide between competing proposals about what results they would
Mm-hmm.
get, if I gave them a lot of money, you say, well, anybody who can put together a cross-silo team to work on this can spend this much money without further reference, and we'll see
Yeah.
what works. Now, what I've done is I've reduced the cost and I've reduced the risk, but that's a complexity-based intervention.
And you've reduced a little bit, I guess, the human dynamic of creating a business case to an idea that I'm already attached to and ignoring the things that's, yeah.
Yeah, that's it. I say S-tran mapping works the same way. In Deleuzian terms, what it does is it deterritorializes
Mm-hmm.
space so that new patterns
Mm.
can emerge.
And what's your experience in terms of, so if a company says, okay, we want to go this direction, but it's really foreign to us. This is not how we've operated before, right? So I guess you bring in SenseMaker as the way to collect. Yeah.
Yeah, we've been working on that. I mean, we're about 6 months later than I wanted to be,
Okay.
right? But one of the things we said, okay, so in an early adopter market, we sell to people who want to understand the theory. We do projects with them. They have to be cross-trained,
Hmm.
etc. Now people are just buying output. So what we've been putting together is what are called quick
Yeah.
sensors. So we're putting our expertise, for example, into cultural
Hmm.
mapping, into understanding the state of AI in your organization, into this sort of mass sense of involving your whole engagement. And all you have to do is pay £950. You get a website and you get a report every week for 3 months, and then you can come and
Yeah.
talk to us. Now, I think that's the sort of thing we're starting to do, is make it easy for people to play with the ideas before they commit major resource. And all the stuff I'm talking about is like S-tran mapping, right? S-tran mapping is 2 half days, and it identifies what you can change and what you can change
Hmm.
easily, and gets people to change the environment so the things you want are less energy consumptive. So you go to an executive and say, look, you're about to start a major project. Why don't we just do this first? Because that will de-risk
Yeah.
your project. And I think that's what people need to be doing.
And from my experience, I mean, the Thnk community, which I'm a part of, first of all, extremely helpful individuals. You've got quite a few people who've been doing this for many years in different forums in different countries, and people don't realize, that those of us, with 3 years maybe with you guys, which would make me very junior compared to a lot of people who are part of your community. One is that everyone is really, so many people are willing to help one another out and reflect on the things that they're preparing for their other clients, obviously, without all the details, which is private data. um, yeah, and so that there are a lot of people out there who've got the background to help organizations with that. And at the same time, you've made a tool which allows people who just have a little bit of, interest and don't need to have that whole background to get started and to see a lot of things in their companies which they were not seen, and in the people that are in their companies which they weren't seen before. And having run SenseMaker myself, I think one of the interesting, I mean, SenseMaker is an amazing tool. Maybe just set the context for those who don't know. It's a mass ethnography tool, right? So it allows to collect micro stories based on questions, or scenarios rather, that we put forward, and then people self evaluate their stories based on a number of questions with, yeah, triads, dyads, and all of this. So I know you explain this obviously better than I do, but you take out the person who's interpreting normally the results and adding their worldview and biases on top. And I was on a project where we did that, and the richness of the stories across multiple languages and multiple countries was unfathomable. It really starts to give you a view of what's going on. But my experience is you still need the people who are sponsoring this to understand that it's not a one stop shop. It's not one set of answers is going to fix all of their problems. It is a process of engagement. Would you say that's a good way of explaining it?
Yeah, I'd say so. I think we've also found that it's often difficult to explain what's called
Hmm.
assemblage mapping, all right, which is the
Yeah.
distributed ethnography. But once people see their own stories,
Hmm.
they get it. Hence, they're starting to do that because what you've got is the statistical objectivity
Hmm.
of numbers and the explanatory power of narrative combined. Right, and it also changes the game. So, for example, the stuff we're doing on culture
Yeah.
mapping at the moment, right? Culture is
Hmm.
an emergent property. You can't tell people what culture they should have. It's like there's all this nonsense about an agile mindset. I mean, you can't do that. It's called indoctrination, and we really
No.
don't want to be doing that, right? What we can do, so what we can do is people choose a cartoon, they tell a story about why they've chosen the cartoon, they index it onto all positive indexes, so they've got no idea what the
Hmm.
right answer is. From that, we draw a pattern map, and then an executive can look at it and say, well, actually, I'd like more stories like these and fewer
Hmm.
stories like those. That's called micronudging. Right? And that is far more risk free than a massive change program based on defining culture in platitudes on flip charts. It's this sort of let's kind of like do small things now and see what the right directions are rather than overcommitting up front. And I mean, I finished S-Rime mapping more or
Okay.
less now, to be honest. Right, the big thing I'm working on is
Yeah.
risk matrices. So, how do you create a balanced portfolio of risk based on the concept that emergence can be accidental or forced and interventions can be fine grained
Yeah.
or large grained? And I'm getting really excited by that. We tried it out a couple of times now with executives and they get it. Yeah.
So, like,
So moving people into portfolios, into doing smaller
yeah,
things faster before you commit too much resource, that makes a lot of sense
and
to C
that's
level.
what
Whereas I've got an agile transformation program. Let's train everybody and give them certificates. Executives are getting a bit pissed off with that these days.
that's what I wanted to ask or to say is, once we see like the stories or an executive sees the stories that they want more of, there isn't a linear path to there. It's then a set of experiments to figure out what nudges, as you said, the system in that direction, right? And do some small scale experiments, multiple ones, and whatever you see that seems to be nudging towards the direction of more of the stories that you want, then increase.
And from an executive point of view, what you're also doing is you're not putting much energy in yourself. You're
Hmm.
stimulating the
Yeah.
system. Then you're looking at what
Yeah.
comes back, and that's risk
Hmm.
reduction,
Yeah.
right? And I think what you'll see is that the sort of big transformation programs are going to start to disappear. They're already starting to disappear. And what we're going to see is much more. So, if I take the metaphors, scientific management ran off a military metaphor. And people, because it was the only model available when people
Mhm.
created it, and people are negative about that. They haven't worked with military. Military metaphors are really
Okay.
adaptive. Sergeants can have authority over a brigadier in some
Hmm.
contexts. All right. But what happened with systems dynamics and engineering is that we suddenly shift into an engineering metaphor in which everything has to be designed up
Hmm.
front based on outcomes. Yeah, and that framing is actually not the way to do it. Yeah. Um, Whereas we're now moving into a much more human ecosystem approach, which says, why have you got a strategic plan to be the world's leading cactus grower if you live in a paddy field? What you've got to do is to work out what the soil is, what the nutrition is, what the water flow is before you decide what to
Hmm.
plant. And that's just logical, but it's only now that people will listen
Hmm.
to it.
I would imagine that we should be thinking in the same way when it comes to social challenges that we're facing as well.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things we've now done it enough to know how to do it, and we're actually in the process of creating a funding request. We want to raise about 10 to
Okay.
20 million for this. Is we've got a vision by which every child at the age of 16 in every school in the world becomes a citizen journalist to their
Hmm.
local context. And we know how to do that, and we know how to scale it, and we know all those good things. Yeah. But we can't do that on the basis of people doing one project at a time. We want to
Yeah.
do something much bigger. Yeah. Now, the argument, if we got that, is that you're doing your research before you know what you need to look for.
Hmm. Okay.
So you can study that, you can pick up weak signals. If you need to measure attitudes, then, I mean, we're going to get another plague soon. And to be honest, it's likely to be bacterial, which is far more
Hmm.
dangerous than viral in terms of human transmission. Yeah. And we're going to need to measure attitudes of people at school district level before we do things like
Hmm.
lockdown, because attitudes matter. Those are the sort of things we're building. In the EU Field Guide on Complexity, it says basically use your citizens as a sensor network. And that doesn't mean social media consultation because that's too easy for bad
Right.
actors to gain. So when we did the Ponte project for the European Union, that was Beth, myself, and Anne and others, we said, well, why don't we just focus on getting the input right rather than trying to be clever with algorithms
Hmm.
on the output? So if you know the source is valid, then that data is reliable. So those are the sort of things we're now starting to do in social conditions. And it also allows us to do some quite clever stuff. For example, introducing
Yeah.
transgenerational pairs. So putting young people with retired people with people in government and running 15 or 20 of those trios at a local problem so that it generates solutions which are sustainable in that context, rather than commissioning somebody to do a huge study for a year and write a report about if we do this, one things will be wonderful in 3 years' time. We're moving to something much more immediate and also much more distributed. I mean, one key principles behind SenseMaker is called
Hmm.
epistemic justice, which is the right to
Yeah.
interpret your own material. And part of the problem with it was bad enough before AI, it's get even
Yeah.
worse with AI, in that you're handing over your interpretation to a set of algorithms trained on a very, very specific, to be quite honest, male
Yeah.
right wing culture, because that's where most of the training data sets come from. So yeah, we originally developed SenseMaker, ironically, for
Hmm.
the US government to create epistemically balanced training data sets for AI. That was
Oh
its
wow.
original
Okay.
objective. And
Yeah.
we can still do that.
Yeah. Does the political context, would the political context have to change in order for the, let's say, mass journaling from young people around the world to be?
No, I don't think so. I think most people from all backgrounds, young people have this delightful naivety
Yes.
in their ability to influence adults, which consultants don't.
No, because I'm thinking, I read, I think you posted, but recently that Wales is considering what outlawing or making it illegal for politicians to lie or something, right? Which changes the context drastically, I think. Do we need?
But that's
Yeah.
possible. It's possible in Wales. It would be a step too far in the States. So this is the issue about creating contextual solutions which go to the next right
Okay.
step. All right. So, and I don't want to get sorry. I'm working on this
Yeah.
at the moment. I think you've always got to recognize where people are and where they
Okay.
came from. Yeah. And you need to look at the context of deprivation in parts of the
Hmm.
US. And we can see the same thing in parts of former Eastern Germany at the
Right.
moment. And those are I mean, the fundamental principle about populism, which is always really dangerous for the working
Yeah.
class, is it generally arises from an impoverished white male working
Yeah.
class. So we've allowed the conditions to
Hmm.
arise under which very negative things for society as a whole will
Yeah.
emerge. I mean, if you studied the Weimar Republic, you can see an almost exact
Okay.
replication in Europe at the moment. All right, but you've got to stop saying why it's wrong. I kept arguing this in States on one of the
Yeah.
projects I'm on. Please stop telling Trump he's wrong. Stop
Yeah.
mocking him in the sense of being an intellectual
Right.
mocking, because all you're doing is reinforcing the sort of negative populism that comes
Right.
for it.
You're making the argument that he's making. Yeah. But
It's
yeah.
reinforcing it, all right? You've got to create empathetic moments in which people say, well, I don't like that. That's
Yeah.
not me. But they've got to work that out for themselves. You haven't got to tell
Hmm.
them. Yeah. And you've also got to recognize differences. I remember, and I won't say who the client was, I did a month or so's field ethnography in Tea Party communities in the
Okay.
Midwest. And I remember going back to DC and said, you guys have got these all wrong. They're socialists.
Hmm.
They all look after each other. Everybody's looked after. It's based around the church. They can't understand why the state needs to get involved. But because you're big city people, you think they're right wing. They're not right wing. But you're going to make them right wing if you carry on castigating them the way you are. So this is this thing about understanding where people are and where they
Hmm.
come from, rather than deciding everybody should be like you,
Now,
which is, by the way, the big problem in organizational change initiatives.
that yes, there's one model that everyone should be like, and very often the person who hires you at the executive level thinks that they've already reached that point that everyone should be like.
Or you get, the complete nonsense of adult maturity models or vertical development models, or God help us, the special development
Hmm.
goals, all right? Where somebody says, I am in an elite position, I have reached a higher state of enlightenment, I will help you to reach that. And that's really dangerous. But there's a lot of it around.
So I mean, this may be a stupid question, and I get to ask them since I created this channel. Um, but like, we're bombarded with information about the other, about othering the other, both from political, I would say, figures on all sides, but also from social media. And you talked about creating these moments of empathy. How do we go about seeing through the like yeah, how do we go about it's small steps, right? As you said, like it's not going to be, I can't imagine a future where we're jumping from one corner to the other in one go. What are the small steps that we can do to create those moments and to yeah.
You're hitting me in one of my frustrations at the
Okay.
moment because we've got a lot of people who are well
Hmm.
intentioned, but they've never bothered to investigate the science of this
Okay.
stuff. So they've all decided how things should be, and they're getting money to go and do things, and it's making things worse, not better in many
Yeah.
cases. Sometimes it's better, but even when it's better, it doesn't scale. Yeah. So let me talk a bit about
Yeah.
that. So one of the projects I did way back in Northern Ireland, and I was part of a bigger team on this, is we didn't get Catholics and Protestants together during the Troubles and get them to talk about why they should really get on with each other. I mean, that's wonderfully satirized in Derry Girls. Because you can get anybody to agree anything in a workshop, but if you don't change the social context, it all changes when they go
Yeah.
back. What we did is we took asymmetric groups of Catholics and Protestants, never more than a group of five, and we dumped them into the slums of Rio de Janeiro for 3 months. And they suddenly discovered they had a lot more in common than they realized, but they had a conversation about their differences in the context of discovering the other person was a human
Mm.
being. Now, one of the things we know we can do with the school children program is we can actually do that at massive
Mm.
scale. And what you're doing there is you're introducing human contact buffering into the information flow.
Okay. See.
So to make this really
Yeah.
simple, right? I tell a story, you tell a story. We like each other's
Yeah.
stories, so we listen to other stories like that.
Hmm.
Right now, in the internet, that's completely unbuffered. So you end up being clustered with people who think just like
Yes.
you. So, as a friend of mine in the Mounties said, it used to be that every village had an idiot and it didn't matter because everybody knew who the idiot
Hmm.
was. But now the idiots have banded together on the internet to legitimize
Hmm.
idiocy. Now, if you know the theory of this, you know that unbuffered information loops will reinforce that side of prejudice. So you say, how do I introduce
Yeah.
buffering? Well, increasing contact across boundaries, but changing the granularity so people are working at really small projects like rubbish in my
Yeah.
street, rather than getting into discussions about Democrats and Republicans or left and right, so that they start to realize it. And the other thing for most of us in complexity theory, and there's a whole bunch of books on this now in political science, are basically saying the old categories of worker capitalist, socialist, right wing, those categories don't apply anymore. We're in a very different
Yeah.
world now, and we need to rethink it.
I mean, being Canadian and now living in Europe for, I mean, this time 7 years, but 13 years in total, we definitely don't have it perfectly in Canada, obviously. And our history with the First Nations, Inuit and Métis, is something that we need to um, acknowledge, not only acknowledge, but continue to take steps to make right. Um, but in the Canada that I know from some years ago, we have been multicultural and figuring out how that works for quite some time, where a lot of conversations I feel that we can have, even if they're uncomfortable and difficult. In Europe, I feel that things are much more difficult here, that there is more othering in that sense. Do we need to start encouraging our local city mayors and local governments to be undertaking initiatives that bring people together on projects with which are not aimed at making them do or talk about anything? Could that be a
And I'd be cautious, to be honest, on Canada. I mean, what people in the West think of Ottawa doesn't bear repeating in polite society at times. And if you
it's
go to Banff or Calgary, right,
yes,
it's kind of like,
we still have so definitely racism, and we still have a lot of
and you've also had the advantage of putting your First Nation people in reservations, so you don't have to encounter them very often. So I'm just giving some
no, I
perspective,
completely
right?
agree with you.
Um, I think the issue, I mean, and we're also going to face massive effects of climate change. I mean,
Mhm.
we're wargaming at the moment the impact of, you know, the first multi-million person heat death
Mm.
is going to happen sometime in the next
Yeah.
10 years. And the implications of that for refugee status and food and water is
Yeah.
huge.
So we're going to get more migration and more stress at our borders and within.
Othering is therefore a problem. So you've got to increase the human
Hmm.
contact. Yeah? And I still remember I was working with one of the UK police forces, I better not say who, on
Yeah.
racism. And I was sat with a group of officers, including one black officer, and they were venting off about Paki bastards. And I said, but he's Pakistani. And I said, yeah, but he's our Paki
Mm.
bastard. Now, I'm not saying that's right or legitimate, and I don't think he was happy with
Yep.
it, but they did
Mm.
distinguish, yeah, because they knew him and they worked with him. And I think that's that concept of getting the granularity right and getting the problems right. Yeah. So one of the projects we've got going at the moment, for example, is finding and capturing stories about small sacrifices at local level to actually make the climate better.
Okay.
Now, once we get those to a critical mass, then politicians on 4-year election cycles will be prepared to make the big sacrifices.
Mm.
But until you change the
Yep.
substrate, those big decisions aren't possible. Yeah. And also, you've got to get people engaged. So there's a lovely British phrase, I got it from Mike Harding, which is doom and dire
Okay.
prognostications. So if you have people going around like Old Testament prophets, yeah,
Yep.
preaching doom and dire prognostications, what actually happens is everybody says, well, I can't do anything about the problem, I'll ignore
Hmm.
it. So you've got to make problems hyper local
Okay.
and get engagement running at that level. And by the way, that's exactly true in organizational change as it's true in a city
Hmm.
state or a country. I think there's other issues on this. I mean, I've been working in Singapore for ages. One of the big conversations we've had several times with the permanent secretaries, and I think most of us are agreed, is the future is city states and small countries, not big
Yeah.
countries, because they're small enough to have cultural cohesion, so they're leverage
Hmm.
points. Yeah.
Yeah. d- do we get to smaller states and nations through our own willingness and innovative endeavor, or do we hit a wall and?
I mean, I was part of a Bruges discussion on this. I mean, and I'll declare it. I'm a member of the Welsh Nationalist Party, right?
Okay.
Um, and the argument we made is that the value of the European Union, and this is before the nonsense of
Right.
Brexit. The trouble is the European Union is distorted by major nation states like Germany,
Hmm.
France, yeah, UK. And part of the problem with the UK leaving is it unbalanced
Okay.
it. Yeah, for the Scandinavian links with the UK and stuff like that. He said what you actually need is Europe needs to be big enough to outcompete Russia, China, and the States in terms of finance and
Hmm.
military. But what he actually wants is lots and lots of smaller states which actually have to find ways to compromise. Now, if you look at France or Germany or
Yeah.
Spain, the medieval cultural model still exists. The Languedoc is not Paris. Brittany is not Paris.
Mm.
Yeah, Catalonia is not
Yeah.
Madrid. Yeah, Swabia is not Prussia, is not, yeah, and I could go
Right.
on, right? So we still have these natural cultural identity clusters where people would make better decisions at a local
Hmm.
level. And you see this in one of the things we saw in Wales, for example, after quasi independence, and here's quasi, is all the politicians had gone to school with each other.
Mm.
So they sort of knew each other. You see the same in New
Yeah.
Zealand. Whereas in England, one party went to private school. So you don't get that already local
Right.
knowledge. Yeah.
Hmm. So then, in a way, going to private schools in other countries for higher education and then coming back into politics can create or disconnect from the local.
But it's a good example. So, for example, when I went to school in Wales,
Yeah.
all right, I mean, we had separation at 11 into academic and non
Okay.
academic. And I was opposed to that at the time. I'm not sure it wasn't a good thing. All right. So, whether it was right or wrong, we don't know. All
Okay.
right. But there were issues. But the point is, everybody went to one of those two schools or the Welsh language school.
Right.
Yeah. And it was your catchment area. And then what actually happened is governments introduced parental choice, which actually isn't choice. And so the better schools got better and the worse schools got worse. Yeah, and that is actually produced really bad effects, particularly in big cities like
Mm.
London. Yeah, and there is an argument to basically, if you got rid of the private schools, those rich parents with power
Yeah.
would have to make the state schools better, and you see much more of that in places like
Mm.
Finland. Yeah, where actually, and then the schools become an integration. I mean, I was in a class with, you know, farmers and people from, council housing in the States whose fathers were in prison, and we were all in the class
Mm-hmm.
together. All right. Whereas these days you wouldn't be. Yeah. So I think that integration, we also know that, if you look at plasticity, you don't see racism in kids before puberty.
Okay.
After puberty, it sets in. So by early 20s female, late 20s male, you more or less lock down based on the prejudices of your
Okay.
society, because you've got to live in it. So the agents of change are young people.
Mm.
Yeah. And so that's where we're trying to
Yeah.
focus, is create these mechanisms by which young people can bring people together across boundaries, but at a hyper local level without facilitation.
Okay.
Because there's far too many people who want to facilitate people becoming like them.
Yes. A facilitation with an inclination for already certain things.
It's called
Yeah.
neocolonialism.
Yeah. Facilitate. I'm here to help, right?
Yeah. I know what's good for you.
Right. Which we find a lot of, unfortunately. And I think that's, one of the things that you advocate, which is like, well, change the system, not the people. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Well, it's changed the
yeah.
interactions. I mean, which is both ethical and more
Mm.
practical. You can't change
Yeah.
people. Well, you can, but it involves generally torture, psychological or physical.
Yeah.
And I would say that there's a lot of psychological torture in
Mm-hmm.
organizations, often by those people who are talking about psychological safety, because they've decided what it means.
Yes. And change.
And God help you if you
Yeah.
disagree with them. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember we created in one of the teams that I work with. We created a change framework for the organization. They didn't want to use the standard one, which was fine. I tried to use some stuff that was already out there, and then at the end, and I was part of it. We actually put the emotions of people going through this, this change cycle. And I remember around 3 or 4 months later, I called up the team like, guys, sorry, I was part of this, but we have to take that off. There's no way that I can make a person go from whatever was the starting point, frustrated, to engage, because I can't make people feel anything. And plus, you have people who will be frustrated from beginning to end, but they're still going to do the work. They're still going to, participate highly, and they're going to be effective afterwards. So, but the idea that we can make people feel emotions or go from one to another within a fixed process of time as we're doing a transformation, it was, and I was part of it. So I'm not blaming anyone. I also got into that mode.
It's I mean, that's the trouble you got with OD in many ways, all right, is they want everybody to be
Oh,
enthusiastic.
yes,
It's that happy clappy stuff,
absolutely.
all right? A lot of people are very happy to turn up at 9, work really hard, go home at
Yes,
5. They'll do overtime if you pay
yes,
them, but I mean, I've got two relatives like this, all right, and they can't understand all this motivational crap. They will do a professional
yeah.
job,
But it's
yeah,
just work,
but
right? It's work, and they'll,
going on team bond, yeah, and they do it so they can do the things they want,
exactly.
and it's perfectly
Yeah,
legitimate.
yeah. But I mean, that leads me to sort of further explore with you, like the creating the situations of empathy and meeting people where they are. I think there's some difficulty around when we see violence or extreme behavior as to how can we meet people when they're there, because there's an internal mechanism of like, that's, that passes my boundary of what I'm able to.
And to be honest, there is a point where you just have to say no and arrest people and put them in
uh,
prison. Yeah, so this is not a universal either,
right.
but you don't want those conditions to
Yeah.
arise. All right. Now, I mean, I mean, Singapore, for example, if you actually go and look at their public housing
Hmm.
blocks, they're income banded and racially mixed,
Okay.
including spaces for old people to meet young people and food courts with shops which actually have stuff which everybody can
Yeah.
buy. Singapore has the highest rate of interracial marriage of any country in the
Oh,
world.
okay. Wow.
And that's really impressive because that really is the ultimate
Yeah.
taboo. And I mean, they've got two Gurkha regiments in case they ever have political violence, but they've hardly ever had any. And they only had one once in Little India. But what they're doing is they're creating a substrate of local interactions of people who appear to be different, but putting them in common groups. Now, my family, or at least my mother's family, came out of Cardiff Docks.
Okay.
So, yeah, my mother was born in, I think, a sort of one room type. That's where she grew up,
Yeah.
right? And it wasn't fun. She fought her way out with education. But if you look at the history of Cardiff Docks, people from multiple cultural and racial backgrounds were all at the same level of poverty, so they worked
Mm.
together. Yeah. And the hatred didn't arise because there was enough balance in it. Um, so I think, that there's models we can
Yeah.
look at and understand what
Yeah.
happened, and start to try and scale that. But there are times when it goes too far. So I mean, I've never been a pacifist. I taught just war theory,
Mm.
right? And if somebody, is intent on invasion, and the classic example of if Hitler and the appeasement of Hitler,
Mm-hmm.
and we're seeing similar things going on at the moment. There's a point where some things become perverted, and you've got to do something
Mm.
about it.
Yeah, I'm just a little bit freaked out by the fact that hundreds of pagers exploded on human beings a couple days ago.
Yeah, that wasn't good, and the issue about what will happen to Eastern Poland and Estonia if NATO doesn't act.
Mm.
And there's some bad things in the world at the
There,
moment.
there are, and yeah, we seem to have. I mean, obviously, this is not my.
If it's any
Yeah,
comfort, it was just as bad in the Middle Ages. It's just we do things at worse scale now.
yeah. I mean, I, but that's why isn't like I had a conversation a week ago with a couple of people saying, yeah, but Eric, on average, there are less wars, there's less death, there's less, and it's the book from our Swedish.
But there's higher consequence. I think that's the problem in a connected world. Though there are less
Yeah,
wars, though that may not be the case for much
yeah.
longer. All right, the consequences are much higher.
And I feel like often those who are having that conversation are not those who are sitting in war, who are saying that, well, on average, we're much better and we live longer, which I think is even debatable depending on the
No,
times.
that's changing in some areas now.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think and you've got to get real. I mean, it's interesting, right? So there's a really good book. I've forgotten the name of the woman who
Okay.
wrote it about post-Soviet Britain.
Okay.
LSE political professor, and she basically says if you look at economics, historically economics was very pragmatic. I can take you back to Gresham in Elizabeth's time and so on. It was kind of like we know some things have some effect, but we'll do things, we'll see what happens, we'll model things, we'll move
Right.
around. At Keynesianism, it will muddle through. But there have been two ideological approaches to
Mm-hmm.
economics. Yeah, one was Soviet Russia, and the other was neoliberal
Okay.
economics, in which people start with the theory and ignore the pragmatic
Mm.
responses. Right? And that always produces perversion because you can't derive a theory from observations in that sort of
Right.
sense. And I think that's part of the problem on peace and reconciliation and politics. All right, when we're not creating a
Mm.
mechanism, yeah, by which things can happen, and we're not recognizing the ideology. I mean, the way Thatcher and Reagan teaching Gorbachev triggered Yeltsin, which triggered the criminal control of Russian industry, which triggers Putin. Putin was a Russian Orthodox hidden convert, yeah, when he was in the KGB. And the Russian Orthodox Church has always been trying to restore Rus. Now, I can guarantee you 95% of people you talk to will not even know that
Mm.
stuff.
No.
And therefore, they don't realize how it's informing how people
Mm.
behave. Right. So, and that I think that's one of the problems is knowing the history, knowing the insight. I mean, the example I often give. Um, so there's little dialogue going on social media. So a bunch of English walkers have said they'll never come to Wales again, because there were anti-English people in Wales. Now, when you look at what they said, it's kind of like, guys, you're exaggerating this and you're making it up, all right? And this myth that people start speaking Welsh when you go into the pub. Well, actually, they're speaking Welsh because it's their bloody native language, for God's sake. So why are you complaining? But the English have always believed that everybody should speak English,
Yeah.
right? But equally, you've got to look at it, and you've got to say, well, if you look at Welsh history, our slate industry, our coal industry were the dominant economic powers of the world, but all the money went to England and then went to
Mm.
Wales, and we've ended up with the aftermath. And my grandmother, if she spoke Welsh in school, had a wooden badge hung around her neck. And she had to catch one of her friends speaking Welsh, and whoever wore it at the end of the day got thrashed by the teacher.
Hmm.
and nobody in England believes you until you
Yeah.
prove it. And you say, well, you've got to understand, all right, that's within one generation. You are going to get a reaction. Same with First Nation in
Yeah.
Canada. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. First.
I mean, you guys weren't as bad as the Americans were on Native Americans, but
Well, we
I also guarantee you, most English people and most Canadian people will not know about the betrayal of Native Americans in
in
the
the
Treaty of
treaty. Yeah.
Ghent.
Yeah. Yeah. And most
But
Canadians. Yeah.
most Native Americans still know about
Yes.
that.
And I mean, I've only read up recently about it, and also my own family history, because obviously Vautrin at some point was a settler. Actually, they were two soldiers, and after the British won, the British allowed the French soldiers who wanted to return to go home safely, and those who wanted to stay, and one stayed. Um,
And the French Canadians fought for the British against the Americans in the War of 1812, which really upset the Americans because they hadn't expected that.
Yeah. So, but I know, yeah, I can't compare the level of let's say, genocide that we inflicted in Canada versus the U.S. But as you probably know, the school system, right, that took children away, I think, until the 1960s or 70s in Canada.
It wasn't as bad. The States, but remember this: the genocide in the States was partly triggered by the end of the Civil War. So you had basically that
Hmm.
made the Union
Yeah.
Army savage. Yeah, I mean it was the worst casualty rate of any war in human history, and that's also part of the origin.
And I think there's a lot that, and I don't know how the modern education is in Canada around its history. Definitely, I read one of the books from the former Justice Minister of Canada, who's a First Nations chief from out west. And I mean, these are the types of things we need to read. Accounts from people whose families went through it, and listen to what they have to say, and to contextualize things differently, so that, as you said, we there are a lot of tropes that I grew up with, which I didn't know about until much later in life. But that makes me think of, or the example you're giving of Singapore. What would you say is what was different, or what conditions or what contexts allowed them to take that path? And can we learn anything in terms of applying it?
And they had a containable crisis, and that they were thrown out of Malaysia.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's within living memory.
Okay.
Yeah. And they've just celebrated an anniversary, so that the generation of civil servants
Hmm.
I've worked with lived through that. And if you look at what the guy they call Minister Mentor, who died, Lee Kuan Yew, first of all, the housing policy was
Okay.
brilliant, and they realised they needed to build housing, so they built it, and they made sure it was racially
Hmm.
integrated and banded. They also built a meritocratic
Hmm.
educational system, which is genuinely
Okay.
meritocratic. So if you're bright in a Thnk school, you're going to get picked up fairly
Hmm.
fast, and you might end up as a president
Yeah.
scholar. Yeah. The other thing everybody forgets is they've got national
Right.
service, and that creates. And I've been arguing for that from a left-wing perspective
Okay.
for some years. We should, if people give 2 years to the states, we should pay their university fees. If they don't, then they should
Hmm.
pay them
Hmm.
themselves. All right. And part of the goal on that is to increase social engagement and to mix people across cultural silos so they get to know each other, which
Yeah.
they've got extensively. Right. And the best and brightest go into government, not into industry.
Hmm.
That's actually really important in Singapore, and they
Yeah.
pay them accordingly. Yeah, so their president scholars are really scary, right?
Yeah.
Intellectually, yeah, but also they're less than five. They're only about 5 million
Also, yeah.
population. Now we know that you keep under 7 million, you can keep
Yeah.
cultural cohesion. You go above that, you can't.
Are there?
And they've got a state. I mean, they are a democracy. I mean, they've had bad periods, but they. I mean, there is a
Yeah.
genuinely free vote. But because people vote for the main party, they can make decisions over 20, 30-year cycles. Whereas in Europe, people are making
Yeah.
decisions over 2-year cycles. And you can't govern a country on that sort of
Well,
cycle.
yeah, you're gonna promise whatever you need to promise every 2 years, no matter if you implement it or not. And
Yeah, and we should look at the US, where I mean, it's like Vance basically said the other day, "I'll make up any stories if it will help me win the
right.
election," and nobody's questioned that.
Are people in Singapore? I've never been, and I'm asking for generalization, which I also know doesn't make sense. But culturally, are they connected to their lands? Like, is part of their education also around?
Well, Yes and no. I mean, you got Malay groups, you've got a big Indian population. A lot of their army is Sikh,
Okay.
yeah,
Okay.
and so on, right? And there's a good Australian contingent. So
Huh.
Singapore was always a trading state,
Right.
so people moved in, the Malay Chinese the first. So they got the advantage of an existing mixed culture.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, they had the Japanese invasion, and that was one of the great British betrayals. We didn't need to surrender Singapore, but we did. And the consequences were pretty horrendous,
Oof. Yeah.
right? But again, that sort of informed things. Then you get the expulsion from Malaysia. So all of those sort of things come
Hmm.
together. Yeah. So context is king,
Yep.
right? But you look at it. I mean, if I go down to Perpignan, for example, to watch
Yep.
rugby, they see Barcelona as their capital, not Paris.
Oh.
Yeah, so the two
Yeah.
Pyrenees states still exist
Hmm.
culturally with their own languages. So I think that's my point. We need to start to think more about cultural groupings at a smaller
Yeah.
scale and allow those cultural groupings to make their own distinctions. So, for example, in Wales, ever since there was a vote in Wales, and there wouldn't have been if it hadn't been for the Chartist movement, right? Wales has voted for the most left wing party available to them in the UK consistently every election.
Okay.
Yeah, but then England is the other way.
Hmm.
So nobody in Wales would question, for example, paying more taxes to get more social good because we're a tribal
Yeah.
culture. So recognizing that different cultures want to do things in different ways and there isn't a universal is also important.
And we've been talking about obviously social dynamics a lot. This connects to business too, right? Like I have the feeling, yeah, that we still. I mean, LinkedIn, of course, is a business platform, but we still act in a way as if, well, business is just business. And I think it's Daniel Schmachtenberger that says, we internalize profits and we externalize negative consequences. Um, there are connections between the social and the business, and both influence one another and interact. Is there anything we can take away from what we've been talking from a social perspective as to where the role of business can play or have positive influence on how the dynamics evolve?
You could start by trying to get Daniel to come up with some micro solutions rather than telling everybody why we're all doomed. All right, but sorry, I've known him for years. All right,
Fair
um,
enough.
and I do think there are problems on that.
Hmm.
Right, and I think there are far too many people diagnosing what's wrong for other
Yeah.
people rather than changing interactions so they can discover what's right for them.
Okay.
And I think that's one of the lessons that comes
Hmm.
across. Yeah. So role-based teams with authority to make decisions without going through bureaucracy is a way that you get a more effective
Hmm.
organization, but also a way by which people engage and show you how they want to engage in different
Hmm.
ways.
And can you introduce,
Doing cultural.
sorry to interrupt, can you introduce in there within the roles, I mean, an agent which is acting on behalf of the larger society in terms of consequences to those business?
Yes, you could do, and I think there's interest on that, and also you can increase some of the work we've done, for example, in South Africa and Australia, where a whole area is totally dependent on a single industry.
Mm.
Yeah, you can start to increase the threaded patterns between the local community and industry in a way that executives understand the
Hmm.
implications. Yeah. You've also got the advantage there is that, senior management and workers often meet on the side of a football pitch where their kids are playing on a Saturday. And that's actually, we've used that quite a few
Mm.
times as a method of social integration. Yeah. So I think, the key concept on complexity is entanglement. The more things they're entangled, the more they're independent, then the more they're interdependent, and that's what you need
Mm.
to do.
Yeah, I mean, you're just making me think how there seems to be, again, I'm generally one group of people who are ignoring reality in terms of, I mean, global warming. As you said, I just was listening to something this morning reminding me that in 2003, the heat wave, I think, killed 70,000 people in Europe. And it's going to get worse shortly. So, but there's a part of us that psychologically is just ignoring that as if, oh, yeah, it's a thing, but we don't really. Yeah.
Yeah, but one of the reasons for
Yeah.
that is human beings respond to proximate danger, not distant
You're
danger.
right.
So, and that's just how we've
Yeah.
evolved. All right. So you've got to make things, I talked about this earlier, you've got to make global warming
Yes.
proximate before people will see
Mm.
it distant.
So talking about
But you've
the
got people who just want everybody to talk about the
yeah.
big problem, and that's a sort of 3% of the
Hmm.
population. It's not the 97% you actually need to
Right.
engage.
So talking about how the ocean currents are completely shifting and so on and so forth, while scientifically valid and useful for discussions around larger policies,
And the
yeah.
government,
But
but it just creates
yeah, but at
despair.
a local level, it'd be like, well, let's look at the lake, for example, here, and what's happened to the fauna, and let's start there, and what can we do as a community?
And people are starting to realize in Britain with the pollution of the
Hmm.
rivers, yeah, like, and the crazy incentives. So, I mean, the River Wye, for example, they set a limit on the size of a chicken farm to try and stop it being polluted. So farmers would set up 5 chicken farms separated by 100 yards. And,
Yeah.
um, it's this rule based culture which came in the 80s
Yeah.
and 90s rather than a judgment based
Mm.
culture. Yeah. And, basically, most of the things we're dealing with now as humans are in the tail of a Pareto
Okay.
distribution, where you can't have rules anyway, but we're using techniques designed for the center of a Gaussian distribution where you've got
Hmm.
repeatability. So rules, I mean, we've done a lot of projects now which show that safety rules are the main cause of mental breakdown in frontline
Yeah,
workers
I heard you say that before.
because they don't understand
Uh,
context. So that's what we're working on with, say, distributed decision making is allow locally contextual decisions to work at scale rather than trying to work out in advance what those decisions should be. And also accepting more failure than people I mean, the irony is we get a huge amount of failure, but everybody says they've devised a system which won't
yeah.
fail. So instead, design a system where the failure can be detected early makes a lot
Yeah.
more sense. Yeah, but people don't do that.
But
I mean, for God's sake, in the
yeah.
health sector, people are going to
Yeah.
die. Yeah. So you can't have a system where nobody dies and where everything's perfectly right each time because that's not the
Yeah.
way it works. New Zealand, by the way, have a really good
Okay.
policy here. Nobody can sue the health. Nobody can sue a doctor.
Okay.
Yeah, there's no legal stuff involved in
Right.
this at all. You can make a claim on a government body if you're subject to medical neglect, and that will assess
Oh
it.
yeah. Okay.
Now, that removes the fear of being
Right.
prosecuted. So if you go into the States, insurance rates are linked to how many people you
Yeah.
kill
Yeah.
or don't save. So there are I mean, when I was working in Bellingham, there are some operations they have to import surgeons from Canada because no American will take
Mm.
the risk. Now that's the sort of nonsense of an explicit outcome-based measurement system, which we've been living with for the past few decades.
And is this system, and maybe this is too broad a question, but is this system sort of, as you said, control and checks an extension or the remnants of colonialism in a sense of
No, I
patriarchal,
don't think
no
so.
control?
No, I think it actually is more recent
Okay.
than that. I mean, colonial powers were quite
Okay.
adaptive. Yeah. I mean, the English conquered, they started with the Welsh, all right? So every time the English invaded Wales, they had more Welsh troops fighting for them than English troops. They just and they did the same in Ireland, the same in India. Yeah, they just split local politics
Mm.
and it was a commercial empire, right? So it was actually quite adaptive and there was a huge amount of local judgment made and some of it was pretty vicious. I mean, a lot of us wish the English would have stopped civilizing people years ago
Yes.
because their concept of civilization isn't ours,
Yes.
all right? But what you see in it, but the rule base,
Yeah.
the sort of idea that you can define cause and
Yeah.
effect relationships, you can define what people should do, that really is a late 20th century
Okay.
phenomenon, mainly driven by popular forms of systems thinking.
Okay. Because we do regularly see that people aren't trusted to have their own judgment, even though they're fully trained and capable. And yes, they will make mistakes, but like, I mean,
Yeah, but actually they shouldn't be. You should never trust an
uh,
individual
I
for
mean,
judgment.
let's say a group of people, yeah, within roles in a context.
A group of
Yeah,
roles, not a group of people. It actually really is a very important
right.
distinction.
A group of roles within a context will more often than not make the best decision within that context.
Make the best decision
Yeah,
possible. Yeah.
which we we don't trust either in the current context very often, but that we can build systems where, I mean, for crying out loud, we've trained these people in those roles, let's put it that way, and we've hired them, and we and to enable them to have that autonomy much more within a broader context would be to everyone's benefit. But for that, we have to relinquish some level of control and
Well, it's what you control. I mean, you can go. I mean, there's a famous story in Britain's history about Canute, who was a Danish English
mhm.
king, and everybody was praising him.
Okay.
Yeah. So what he ended up doing was going back to. He sat on the ocean and commanded the waves not to come in to prove a point to them.
Didn't work, huh?
Yeah. Yeah, it didn't work, right? But he was making
Yeah.
a point, right? And whether it's true or not is an interesting one. But
Well, but like a lot of stories, they're meant to teach more than be necessarily historically accurate, right? Dave, thank you so much. I'd like to ask a couple of closing questions to all my guests. And one of them is, in your view, what do you think we could do or should be doing in order to have a kinder, more compassionate, collaborative society going forward?
change the interactions at a local level, mix people across cultural boundaries, and above all, don't tell them that you want everybody to be like you.
Yeah.
And that's a real problem. I mean, it's part of the woke issue. Yeah, I mean, I buy completely into woke
Yeah.
principles. Is everybody should have equal
Yeah.
opportunity? But stop making people feel guilty if they're just coming from their own cultural context and they haven't learned
And
yet.
they're not woke.
So there needs to be much more a sort of how do we stimulate the system so things will
Hmm.
emerge rather than telling people what they should be thinking.
And in a country like Germany, I think that you're involved, or at least, yeah, you know what's going on here. How would a local mayor or government go about doing that? Is there structures in place that?
We've got structured methods for that.
Okay.
So we can get kids to capture stories. We can then algorithmically identify the stories which have similar
Hmm.
themes, and then we can algorithmically stimulate people to form small teams across boundaries to work on them and allocate small amounts of money without human agency. And that's really important because if you look in nature, all search mechanisms are optimized by distributed intelligence with no centralized
Hmm.
intelligence.
Yeah.
So if you want to change a society, that allows you to then sit as the mayor and look at the patterns and then reinforce ones which are
Hmm.
useful rather than deciding up front what the pattern should be.
Right. Or even deciding on the intervention before having heard anything from the people who live in your communities. Well, if ever, I just moved to the countryside, to an area where in Germany where I think we're only 45,000 people. If ever I get a chance to have a conversation with the mayor and find out how he sees the region and how things are going, definitely something that I would.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we just started a major project which is leading into that with one of the British cities.
Okay.
So as soon as we can announce that, that will give you some
Yeah.
more
You've
ammunition.
done stuff in Sweden too before, if I'm not, or they've done with
Oh
SenseMaker.
yeah, Malmo with the
Yeah.
refugees, just come back from
And
Malmo.
have
Yeah, we've done stuff in South Wales, so we got plenty of
Can
cases.
you talk a little bit about what you've done in Malmo, or is it confidential? And
No, we used young people to actually act as journalists. I mean, Malmo is the main point of entry for immigrants
hmm.
into Sweden, and it's actually considered an exemplar for
Okay,
Europe. So we had youth engagement in capturing stories to understand the patterns of integration. I mean, I think that's published on our
okay,
website. Beth did that, not me. So I'm aware of it, but not the
okay.
detail.
And is it something that, as far as you know, they're now using as input or experience to think of maybe other areas?
No, it had a major
Yeah.
impact. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks for that. And my last question is simply, and my desire to understand more about why we think the way we think as human beings. Is there anyone you think that I should reach out to and talk to and interview?
No, on this, you might want to talk to some of the team, to be honest.
Okay.
I mean, I've been building a team. I mean, three of them, the three who understand delusion epistemology, are doing a joint broadcast to another podcast.
Okay.
So there's a lot of expertise in that group. Reach out
Okay.
to them.
Yeah, I know some of them. I've had the pleasure to talk to them before. So yeah, that's definitely a group of people who have been in the field, who have their own experience, right, using the tools and helping you develop over time. So a good group of people to talk to. Okay. Well, on that, thank you very much for your time, Dave. Really nice chatting to you, and take care.